The morning light entered the parish office at an oblique angle, striking a stack of freshly typed newsletters and setting a faint halo upon the crisp, white pages. Inspector Purbright lingered at the doorway, observing the careful arrangement of staplers, blotters and inkwells that seemed, in their precise ordinariness, to guard the secrets of the small town with a patient impartiality. The typist, Miss Lavinia Cripps, looked up from her work, startled for a moment by the intruding presence of authority, before recovering the polite composure expected of one accustomed to early hours and meticulous records. "Good morning, Inspector," she said, her voice measured, neutral, yet carrying the almost imperceptible tremor of someone guarding information she had not chosen to share. "I arrived a little earlier than usual, to catch up on filing." Purbright inclined his head, noting the stiffness in her shoulders and the slight hesitation before she resumed sorting the envelopes. The parish committee had gathered just beyond the office door, their greetings clipped and careful, each word chosen to maintain social equilibrium while simultaneously conveying minor grievances. Mr. Fincher, the chairman, made a perfunctory nod, but his gaze lingered a fraction too long on the newsletters, perhaps on a misprint, perhaps on a hint of disapproval he did not wish to voice aloud. The inspector's eyes moved methodically across the room. A misaligned ink blot marked the margin of one sheet. A flourish in a signature suggested either fatigue or intentional embellishment. It was the kind of minutiae that, while invisible to casual observation, could reveal the faintest tremor in a community otherwise devoted to decorum. "Miss Cripps," Purbright began, "have there been any irregularities with the correspondence recently?" His phrasing was courteous, deliberately non-confrontational, as though he were inquiring about the weather rather than potential dishonesty. She paused, glancing at a small pile of letters she had tucked neatly to one side. "Only the usual delays, sir. Some letters arrive late from the Historical Society. I do not think there is cause for concern." Her hesitation was slight, but sufficient to set Purbright's mental gears into motion. A clerk's composure rarely faltered unless circumstance demanded discretion. The parish secretary, Mrs. Aldridge, entered with a tray of tea and biscuits, her hands trembling ever so slightly as she arranged cups with exacting care. She offered a polite smile to the inspector which did not entirely reach her eyes. Each committee member took their cup, murmuring thanks and carefully avoiding eye contact with anyone whose actions might be perceived as improvident. "Overdue subscriptions again, I see," muttered Mr. Fincher, in a tone that was almost conversational, yet carried a subtle reproach aimed at no one in particular. Miss Cripps nodded, serene, betraying only a minimal sigh as though she were absorbing the minor disapproval of her superiors with habitual grace. Purbright sipped his tea, noting the social choreography with measured attention. There was a rhythm here, politeness masking irritation, a litany of minor injustices, misprinted hymn numbers, ambiguous donation acknowledgements, an unsent thank-you note, all concealed beneath layers of ceremony and civility. He recorded these quietly in his mind, for such trifles often proved pivotal when reputations and motives intersected. "The vicar mentioned letters arriving out of sequence," Purbright continued, letting his words float in the air like a feather. "Is there any explanation?" Miss Cripps arranged the sugar tongs on the tray, avoiding direct eye contact, a sign familiar to him from past experience. "Occasionally, letters are delivered late or misplaced. It is unfortunate, but I cannot say more." The faint blush that coloured her cheeks suggested she was withholding, not fabricating. There was truth behind her discretion, hidden deliberately. The inspector allowed a brief silence to settle, punctuated only by the quiet clink of porcelain against saucer. From the corner of his eye, he saw Mr. Penton, the treasurer, glancing furtively at a ledger, then at Miss Cripps, as though weighing whether her typing reflected oversight or selective intervention. Purbright's mind catalogued these gestures, noting alliances and rivalries discernible only in the careful avoidance of confrontation. A soft draft disturbed the stack of newsletters, revealing a small, unclaimed envelope resting against the blotter. The vicar's seal gleamed faintly in the morning sun, undisturbed, yet oddly conspicuous. Purbright noted the envelope without touching it, allowing its presence to act as a silent cue. There existed correspondence neither yet processed nor publicly acknowledged, a quiet fissure in the parish's otherwise meticulously maintained order. "Inspector," Miss Cripps murmured, almost as an afterthought, "some letters arrive addressed to me personally. I am not always permitted to open them." The words were delivered with impeccable restraint, but the subtext was unmistakable. Someone in the parish was communicating covertly, relying upon the typist's discretion. The committee, meanwhile, engaged in a subdued negotiation over the proper arrangement of hymnals, a topic seemingly trivial yet revealing. Mr. Finch's insistence on alphabetical order by composer rather than by popularity prompted Mrs. Aldridge to offer an acquiescent nod that conveyed silent frustration. It was a minor social skirmish, entirely devoid of dramatics, yet rich with undercurrents of hierarchy and self-interest. Purbright observed, without interruption, his notebook unnecessary. The office itself recorded every nuance in its quiet, respectful architecture. Miss Cripps moved to retrieve the misplaced ink blotter, brushing against the envelope in the process. Her eyes flickered toward it, and, for a fleeting moment, Purbright detected the subtlest question in her expression, curiosity constrained by duty, awareness constrained by habit. It was this precise hesitation that distinguished ordinary clerical diligence from a guard placed over secrets yet unspoken. By mid-morning the tea had been consumed, and committee members departed in polite succession, their steps measured, leaving behind the faint aroma of biscuits and the quiet resonance of social manoeuvring. Miss Cripps returned to her typewriter, resuming her work with the same careful precision as before, yet now with a new, almost imperceptible tension in her posture. The early morning light shifted across the desk, illuminating the envelope once more, teasing a quiet question into the otherwise orderly room. Whose correspondence had been concealed, and for what purpose? Purbright rose, gathering his coat, yet lingered just long enough to observe the subtle alignment of the newsletters, the deliberate spacing of type, the controlled composure of the typist. In this small theatre of civility and protocol, every gesture, every hesitation, every carefully chosen word had meaning, and the inspector understood that the first tangible clue often arose not from action, but from the absence of it. He departed the office with no announcement, leaving Miss Cripps alone with the typewriter and the envelope. The quiet of the parish was restored, but beneath it lingered a faint tension, a question suspended in the morning light, and a suggestion that the typist's early morning diligence was more than mere routine. It was the custodian of something worth noticing. And so the chapter closed, not with revelation but with quiet anticipation, as Purbright's mind traced the invisible threads of obligation, secrecy, and subtle deception. The envelope remained, its presence a soft, unspoken invitation to observe further, to question, to uncover, without ever forcing the truth into abrupt disclosure. Inspector Purbright arrived at the parish office in mid-morning, finding the room arranged with the same meticulous order as the previous day. The newsletters, now stamped and folded, lay in neat stacks, their margins free of blotches, but still whispering of human intervention. Miss Cripps moved about with quiet efficiency, her gloved hands handling correspondence as though it were a fragile ledger of reputations rather than mere paper. The envelope from yesterday, still unclaimed, rested against the blotter as though daring observation while evading scrutiny. "The Historical Society writes again," Purbright said, indicating a letter addressed in looping copperplate. "It appears this one has not been delivered." His tone was neutral, a statement more than a question, yet the phrasing carried an unspoken expectation of explanation. Miss Cripps paused, her fingers resting lightly on the typewriter keys. "Indeed, sir. I have been informed it should have been sent last week. I am unsure how it was overlooked." Her voice was even, measured, but the faint redness at her temples suggested a delicate embarrassment. Purbright noted it silently. Clerical missteps rarely produced such subtle physical evidence unless they were significant enough to affect social perception. Mrs. Aldridge appeared from the back room, carrying an additional tray of tea. She offered the inspector a polite smile, which trembled slightly as she set down the cups. "I assumed it had been sent, Inspector," she said, voice courteous, but edged with mild defensiveness. "Perhaps Mr. Penton?" Her gaze flicked ever so briefly to the treasurer, who looked uncharacteristically distracted while shuffling a stack of ledgers. Mr. Penton's reply was measured, almost theatrical in its civility. "I do not believe the omission was deliberate. Clerical matters do sometimes suffer delays, as everyone knows. One cannot attribute malice where none is evident." He inclined his head to Miss Cripps, whose fingers were again poised above the typewriter keys, her composure unbroken, yet her eyes betrayed a slight tension. Purbright, observing the careful interplay, noted the choreography of polite blame. Each participant had chosen language to preserve dignity while subtly signaling irritation or suspicion. The omission of a single letter, trivial in content, carried within it a lattice of reputational anxiety. The inspector's pen remained in its pocket. The mind, rather than the hand, did the recording. "Have there been other letters misplaced?" he asked, his voice low, deliberate. "Perhaps patterns that merit attention?" Miss Cripps's hands paused for a fraction longer than necessary, the motion almost imperceptible. "Only the occasional correspondence, Inspector. It is rare. One expects errors in a small office such as ours, though it is unfortunate when they appear in matters of social record." Her phrasing was precise, even elegant, and yet it suggested she was carefully controlling the disclosure of her knowledge. Purbright filed this observation alongside her blushes, her hesitations, and the subtle upward tilt of her eyebrows. The room settled into an uneasy quiet, broken only by the soft ticking of the wall clock and the occasional scuff of shoes against the polished parquet. Purbright allowed the moment to stretch, as silence often revealed more than words. From the corner of his eye he detected a slight stiffening in Mr. Penton's shoulders, mirrored by a fleeting glance toward the envelope. Small, almost imperceptible gestures such as these were frequently the repository of hidden truths. Mrs. Aldridge, in an attempt to restore civility, offered an observation about the committee's forthcoming meeting. "The parish council will meet on Thursday. Perhaps these details will be addressed then." She smiled, the edges of her mouth tight, almost as though the phrase itself were a trial in etiquette rather than a neutral statement. The inspector noted the implication. Discussions of minor procedural lapses could be socially perilous if framed incorrectly. "Did anyone else see the letter?" Purbright asked, allowing his gaze to settle on Miss Cripps with a faint gravity. "No, sir," she replied promptly. "It arrived in the Morning Post, and I alone handled the sorting. It was not read by anyone else." Her calm statement carried a subtle edge, hinting at the responsibility she bore, and perhaps the knowledge of whom the oversight might embarrass. The inspector's mind catalogued the combination of isolation, authority, and discretion inherent in her position. There was a pause, filled with polite attention to detail. The careful arrangement of letters by date, the methodical stacking of envelopes, and the quiet brushing aside of minor dust motes from the typewriter. Purbright's eyes, trained for nuance, caught the almost imperceptible way the typist adjusted a single sheet, tilting it fractionally as though signaling something invisible. The motion was minor, yet significant. It betrayed consciousness of scrutiny, a protective measure executed with quiet dexterity. "The newsletter's final page," Purbright murmured, allowing the words to drift without urgency. "It contains minor revisions that seem editorial rather than clerical." He did not raise his voice, nor press the observation with emphasis. The phrasing was indirect, a nudge rather than a question. Miss Cripp's hands paused mid-motion, and a faint tightening of the jaw suggested recognition of the inspector's insight. "Editorial judgment, sir," she replied, her tone deferential. is sometimes necessary when errors or ambiguities appear in printed matter. One seeks to preserve the dignity of the parish. Her words were carefully chosen. The phrase, "preserve the dignity," lingered in the air, a gentle signal of the moral weight inherent in what others might consider minor clerical detail. Purbright's lips curved subtly. The understated humour of social propriety and human self-importance was not lost on him. A quiet knock at the door preceded the entrance of Mr. Fincher, who held a slip of paper folded lengthwise. "I found this among the Morning Post," he said, voice even, "though it appears it should have been dispatched earlier. I trust this will not cause alarm." He handed the slip to Purbright, who examined it with unobtrusive attention. The notation was innocuous to the casual eye, a mere record of a donation dated a fortnight prior. Yet the lack of postmark and the carefully chosen handwriting suggested deliberate intervention. Purbright noted how the envelope's journey, or lack thereof, reflected the intricate social balancing of the parish. What was missing carried as much weight as what had been seen, and the interplay of responsibility, discretion, and etiquette created a lattice of subtle pressures. Miss Cripps's slight nod toward the letter, barely perceptible, was perhaps acknowledgment of her awareness, or of her compliance in concealment. As mid-morning light filled the office, the inspector allowed himself a moment to consider the implications. Clerical lapses might appear trivial, they could be attributed to fatigue or oversight. Yet in a parish such as this, where decorum and reputational propriety governed every gesture, an unmailed letter was a conduit for silent disapproval, passive resistance, or protective concealment. Purbright rose to leave, his coat draping carefully over his arm. Miss Cripps remained at her desk, her fingers poised over the typewriter, her eyes occasionally flicking to the small stack of correspondence. The room settled into quiet rhythm once more. Yet beneath the order a subtle shift had occurred, a minor act of omission, a glance, a blush, and a hesitancy, all forming a constellation of signs, suggesting that the seemingly trivial letter was a thread leading to something worth observing more closely. And so the chapter closed, not with revelation, but with an understated question. Why had the letter not been sent, and what discretion or design lay behind its delay? The envelope rested quietly against the blotter, innocuous to all but the keenest observer, promising that the next visit would require careful attention to gestures, omissions, and the understated language of propriety. The day following the discovery of the unclaimed envelope, Inspector Purbright returned to the parish office under a grey sky, the light diffused and cool, casting the room in even, impartial tones. Miss Cripps was already at her typewriter, fingers poised above the keys, her expression a studied neutrality, though Purbright noted the barely perceptible tightening at the corners of her mouth. The envelope lay untouched, its presence now a quiet fixture in the office, unspoken yet undeniably suggestive. "Good morning, Miss Cripps," Purbright said, his tone even, deliberately casual. "Have there been any developments regarding correspondence?" She glanced toward the envelope with a measured pause. "Only that a visitor called this morning, Inspector, a Mr. Darrow from the Historical Society. He inquired after letters, though he did not leave his card. I could not offer much." Her phrasing was precise, deliberately neutral, yet the slight falter at the end betrayed a hint of unease. The inspector observed the subtle tension ripple across the room. The parish secretary, Mrs. Aldridge, entered quietly with tea, offering her usual perfunctory smile, which barely reached her eyes. Mr. Penton appeared from the ledger room, hands folded behind his back, bearing an expression somewhere between mild curiosity and concealed apprehension. Even the ordinary movements of the staff seemed weighted with implication, as though each gesture might reveal or conceal intention. "Mr. Darrow," Purbright murmured. "He asked after letters not yet dispatched." Miss Cripps inclined her head slightly. "Yes, sir. He mentioned a document that had been expected. I explained only that there was a delay. He seemed satisfied with this, though his eyes lingered longer than polite custom might allow." Purbright made no immediate comment. instead letting his gaze drift across the office, noting the minutiae of social observance, the careful alignment of ledgers, the placement of inkwells, the nearly imperceptible glances exchanged between Mrs. Aldridge and Mr. Penton. The office itself seemed to hold its breath, the architecture lending an air of impartiality to what was, in essence, a drama of restraint and careful observation. "It is curious," Purbright said after a pause, "how the mere presence of a visitor can unsettle even a routine day. One expects disruption only with explicit cause, yet here the subtle shift is evident in posture, glance, and inflection." His words floated lightly, more observation than admonition, and Miss Cripps's fingers resumed their work with a fraction more stiffness than before. The discussion soon turned to the newsletter. Purbright observed how Miss Cripps handled the revisions with methodical care, yet each pause, each adjustment of type, seemed to reflect more than clerical diligence. They suggested an awareness of oversight, a concern for the unseen eyes of parish authority, and possibly of the Historical Society. Small inconsistencies, he noted, might be entirely innocent or carefully orchestrated. Mrs. Aldridge interjected with a note on the parish council meeting, which Mr. Fincher had scheduled for the following Thursday. The phrasing was gentle, almost ceremonial, yet it carried an implicit reminder. Minor lapses in protocol could have consequences if aired too publicly. The inspector nodded, understanding that the risk in small communities lay not in overt wrongdoing, but in the breach of social propriety. "Has Mr. Darrow ever called in person before?" Purbright asked, eyes lingering on Miss Cripps. "Rarely, Inspector. Only when it concerns older records," she replied. "Usually correspondence suffices. His presence today was unusual, I think." Her careful phrasing suggested both propriety and tacit acknowledgement of the anomaly. Purbright noted the delicate balance, acknowledgement without accusation, description without speculation. As the morning progressed, Purbright's attention drifted to the envelope once more. Miss Cripps, in clearing her workspace, adjusted it slightly without touching its seal. The gesture was almost imperceptible, a flicker of awareness or perhaps an unspoken question. It suggested, subtly, that the envelope was both a responsibility and a secret, its existence known but unremarked, acknowledged but not addressed. "The sequence of letters, Miss Cripps," Purbright said softly, "seems to matter more than the content. One can gauge influence and intent by delay, omission, and timing alone." He allowed the statement to hang, observing her hands as they hovered above the typewriter keys, fingers curling lightly around the platen. Her composure remained intact, yet the observer in him detected a faint tension, a vigilance born of habitual discretion rather than fear. Later, a mild commotion occurred in the corridor, a delivery from the post, yet nothing requiring immediate attention. Mr. Penton accepted the parcels with a courteous nod, but his eyes flicked to Miss Cripps as though measuring the potential implications of their arrival. The inspector's awareness of such subtleties heightened, recognizing the small gestures as the means by which the parish maintained order and avoided social rupture. Purbright spent several minutes reviewing the subtle choreography, glances, hesitations, slight adjustments in posture, and careful phrasing in replies. Each micro-movement contained data, and the slow accumulation of these cues revealed an invisible architecture of social power, one that governed attention, discretion, and moral propriety. By mid-morning, the office seemed to settle, though the tension never fully abated. Miss Cripps, now alone with her typewriter, paused as if anticipating another visitor. Purbright, standing by the door, noticed the slight twitch of her fingers over the keys, a faint, involuntary signal, almost imperceptible, but suggestive of awareness of the unseen observer. The envelope remained in its place, a quiet sentinel of correspondence neither yet revealed nor acknowledged. The chapter closed with Purbright's gaze lingering on Miss Cripps, noting the unspoken question reflected in her posture and the gentle alignment of the envelope. The presence of the secret visitor, the delayed letters, and the quiet gestures of caution all hinted at a network of discretion and oversight, yet to be fully unravelled. It was not a revelation, but a subtle opening, a quiet invitation to observe further, to trace the unspoken threads of responsibility and secrecy. The afternoon sunlight filtered weakly through the office windows, casting pale rectangles upon the polished floorboards and the array of carefully arranged ledgers. Inspector Purbright moved among them with deliberate slowness, noting the precise indentation of entries, the careful alignment of columns, and the occasional discrepancy that might otherwise escape notice. The parish accounts, in their meticulous ordinariness, suggested both diligence and restraint, but Purbright's experience told him that even routine ledgers could conceal subtle anomalies. Miss Cripps was at her typewriter, fingers hesitating before each key, as though weighing not just words, but the proprieties of disclosure. She greeted the inspector with a measured nod, her expression neutral yet attentive, a mask perfected over years of service. The envelope, still sealed, lay conspicuously at the edge of the desk. Its presence was a quiet, unacknowledged pressure on the room's equilibrium. "Ledger entries often reveal as much as letters, Miss Cripps," Purbright remarked casually. "Scanning a column of donations and subscriptions, timeliness, omissions, slight adjustments, each carries social meaning, does it not?" She looked up, her composure unwavering, though her eyes betrayed a momentary flicker of attention toward the accounts. "Indeed, Inspector. One must record with accuracy and discretion. Errors are easily remarked upon in small communities." The careful stress on discretion implied delicately that some errors were deliberate or selectively acknowledged. Mr. Penton, the treasurer, appeared from the adjoining room, ledger in hand, moving with quiet ceremony to his appointed chair. He greeted Purbright with a measured nod, as though acknowledging not only the inspector's authority, but also the implicit scrutiny that accompanied it. The slight arch of an eyebrow hinted at awareness. He understood that the ledger, so routinely consulted, could be a stage for observation rather than mere record-keeping. "Inspector," he began, in a voice designed to be both courteous and informative, "you may note that several donations from last month's collection do not appear in the Historical Society's records. I assumed Miss Cripps would advise if there were any discrepancies." His phrasing was precise, lightly deferential, yet contained a subtle suggestion that observation extended beyond the ordinary clerkly function. Purbright, unperturbed, allowed a faint smile. "Discrepancies often have innocuous explanations, Mr. Penton. Yet it is curious how minor lapses, misdated checks, overlooked acknowledgements recur in patterned ways." He glanced toward Miss Cripps, who adjusted a stack of newsletters with deliberate care, her movements unhurried yet alert. Mrs. Aldridge entered quietly, placing a tray of tea upon the sideboard, her hands steady despite the faint tremor in her demeanor. She offered a nod to Purbright and returned to her work, the rhythm of politeness and quiet observation undisturbed. Even the act of serving tea became, in this context, a subtle exercise in social choreography, cups aligned, spoons positioned, and biscuits selected with ceremonial attention. "Miss Cripps," Purbright said, drawing her attention back to the desk, "have you noticed any pattern in the letters addressed personally to you? The timing, the senders, the manner in which they arrive?" She hesitated, carefully arranging her papers. "Some arrive regularly, others sporadically. I am instructed not to open them unless expressly permitted. There is an understanding." Her voice was formal, her phrasing neutral, yet the ellipsis and slight inflection suggested the weight of unspoken arrangements. Purbright noted it, as one notes a shadow in an otherwise tidy room, unremarkable yet insistent. He turned to Mr. Penton. "Do the ledgers reflect these intervals? Any correlation with contributions, committee meetings, or external inquiries?" The treasurer adjusted his spectacles, scanning figures with meticulous attention. "Nothing overt, Inspector, but subtle discrepancies. Perhaps. One might argue that timing and notation could, on occasion, indicate influence or oversight. His choice of words was carefully hedged, accurate enough to suggest insight, cautious enough to avoid accusation. Purbright allowed silence to linger, observing the room. The typist, the treasurer, the secretary all performed their functions with exemplary restraint, yet each gesture, glance, and adjustment contained meaning. Social observation, he thought, was akin to ledger-keeping, minute details compiled to reveal a pattern invisible to the casual eye. A soft noise at the window drew his attention, a shadowy figure of a delivery boy pausing to glance inside before disappearing down the lane. Miss Cripps noticed it too, her fingers hovering momentarily above the keys, a slight tightening at the jaw betraying awareness. Purbright registered the pause, subtle as a comma in a long sentence, and catalogued it. Someone outside was attentive to parish routines and perhaps to the envelope itself. He sipped his tea, reflecting on the interplay between transparency and concealment. Here, in the ordered ledger and the daily routines, lay a quiet tension between obligation and discretion, between accuracy and social propriety. Each party adhered to the rules of civility, yet beneath the surface moved currents of suspicion, alliance, and cautious inquiry. Miss Cripps resumed her typing with careful deliberation, yet her pace now carried the faintest note of deliberation, awareness of observation, a concern for the unseen audience, or perhaps a private anticipation of unfolding events. Purbright observed without intrusion, appreciating the subtle drama enacted through posture, gesture, and attention to minutiae. By late afternoon, Purbright noted the faint discrepancies in the ledgers. A donation undated, a note missing, a balance corrected with no apparent justification. They were not irregularities to alarm, merely anomalies to observe, markers of human influence and discretion in a community governed by propriety. He lingered near the desk, eyes returning one final time to the envelope, which had remained untouched. Its sealed presence, paired with the ledger's quiet anomalies and the typist's subtle vigilance, suggested a network of hidden oversight and carefully managed information. The room, in all its routine ordinariness, had become a tableau of surveillance, discretion, and understated influence. The chapter concluded not with revelation, but with a gentle pivot. The envelope, the ledger discrepancies, and the typist's attentive gestures formed a constellation of quiet signals. Somewhere within this lattice of civility, social propriety, and unspoken authority, a question lingered. What correspondence, what pattern had been so carefully preserved, and by whom? The inspector left the office with no fanfare, his mind tracing the invisible connections, ready to observe the next subtle turn in the parish's understated intrigue. The parish office, bathed in the soft amber light of mid-afternoon, exuded an air of deliberate calm. Inspector Purbright entered with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being noticed without demanding attention. Miss Cripps was already at her typewriter, the envelope from previous mornings resting conspicuously on a corner of her desk. Her hands hovered over the keys as though measuring each movement against invisible standards of propriety. The air smelled faintly of tea and ink, a domestic tranquillity that masked the subtle currents of observation and restraint. "Good afternoon, Miss Cripps," Purbright said, settling into the chair nearest the window. His eyes, deliberate and patient, scanned both the typist and the meticulously arranged desk. "Has there been any further correspondence or visits of note since morning?" Miss Cripps adjusted a sheet of type with measured precision. "Only Mr. Darrow, sir, and one other gentleman who declined to give his name. He asked for letters arriving recently, and I was instructed to direct him elsewhere. I offered only polite explanation." Her phrasing was careful. The ellipsis suggested the weight of discretion. Purbright allowed a pause, letting the silence act as both observation and probe. Mrs. Aldridge entered with tea, her movement gentle yet deliberate, mindful of the hierarchy of chairs, cups, and glances. Each participant in the office observed ritualized deference while simultaneously projecting minor disapproval, an elaborate choreography of social equilibrium. It appears, Purbright mused, that even the simplest visits can disturb the calm of routine. A question asked at the right or wrong moment may unsettle more than a direct accusation ever could. His words, light yet incisive, prompted Miss Cripps to glance toward the envelope, her fingers momentarily tightening over the paper. The imperceptible hesitation was enough to suggest awareness, vigilance, and perhaps unspoken concern. At that moment the door opened, admitting a visitor whose presence immediately introduced subtle tension. Mr. Jowett, a minor member of the parish council, carried himself with precise, almost studied indifference, though his eyes flicked toward the envelope and the typewriter with an unmistakable curiosity. He greeted Purbright with a nod that, while polite, carried a latent inquiry. "Inspector," he began, his voice formal and light, "I wondered whether you might advise on the Historical Society's records. There have been small irregularities noted, and some letters are yet unaccounted for." His phrasing was cautious, bordering on apologetic, yet the implication was clear. Oversight and discretion were under subtle scrutiny. Purbright inclined his head. "Do you mean irregularities of timing or content, Mr. Jowett?" The visitor paused, allowing the question to settle. "Primarily timing," he replied. "Occasionally letters arrive out of sequence or are delayed in their presentation to the committee. One is compelled to consider whether procedural error or human discretion is at play." The inspector allowed a faint smile. "In small communities, Mr. Jowett, even minor lapses carry social weight beyond their practical effect. Timing, order, and perception intertwine with propriety and reputation." His gaze drifted to Miss Cripps, who had resumed typing with measured attention, each keystroke deliberate, weighted by invisible considerations. Mr. Jowett shifted in his chair, glancing at the ledgers and newsletters, then toward the envelope. Purbright noted the subtle tension. The visitor's polite restraint belied curiosity, perhaps even unease. The office itself seemed to absorb the disturbance, remaining outwardly calm while silently recording minute variations in expression and gesture. "Miss Cripps," Purbright said softly, "does the arrival of letters or visitors alter your routine?" She considered the question, pressing a hand lightly against the typewriter's edge. "Only in so far as discretion requires, sir. Certain matters are to be handled with care, and sometimes that means minor adjustments to usual practice." Her tone remained neutral. The meaning lay in what was unsaid, the careful maintenance of procedural and social boundaries. Purbright allowed a silence, punctuated only by the faint sound of keys striking paper. Each click seemed amplified in the quiet office, a metronome of attention and observation. Even Mrs. Aldridge's movements, now clearing cups from the tray, carried a heightened awareness, as though every gesture might be interpreted, consciously or not, by those present. Mr. Jowett's glance fell on the envelope. "I hope, Miss Cripps," he said, his words measured, "that you have not yet been required to reveal its contents. Certain communications should remain private, I trust." She inclined her head slightly, a subtle acknowledgement of propriety. "Yes, sir, they are to be handled as instructed." There was no further elaboration, yet Purbright caught the slight stiffening in her posture, a micro-gesture of awareness, perhaps even anticipation, of future scrutiny. The inspector rose and moved toward the ledgers. He traced the columns with a casual eye, noting small deviations from expected entries. An undated subscription, a note slightly offset from the margin, a minor correction without annotation. Individually, these were trifles. Together they formed a quiet pattern of human intervention, deliberate or inadvertent, in the parish's meticulous record-keeping. "Procedural oversight," Purbright said, turning to Mr. Jowett, "is as much about what is preserved as what is omitted. One observes patterns in order, sequence, and the occasional anomaly, and one gains insight into both intention and discretion." His tone remained calm, the words factual rather than accusatory. The visitor nodded slowly, absorbing the subtle lesson. He rose after a brief pause, offering the inspector a final nod of courtesy before departing. The quiet footsteps receded, leaving the office once more dominated by small gestures, hushed attentions, and the ever-present envelope. Purbright returned to Miss Cripps. "Do you find these visits disrupt your work?" "Only insofar as vigilance is required, sir," she replied, her hands returning to the typewriter. "Routine continues, but one must remain alert to inquiries." Her careful inflection suggested a nuanced understanding of surveillance, responsibility, and the maintenance of order. As Purbright prepared to depart, he allowed a last glance at the envelope. Its sealed presence, combined with the subtle irregularities in the ledgers and the typist's measured attentiveness, suggested a lattice of obligations, concealed knowledge, and understated authority. The evidence of intent lay not in overt action, but in hesitation, alignment, and micro-observations. A web quietly maintained in the service of propriety, discretion, and the preservation of social equilibrium. The chapter closed with a faint, almost imperceptible shift. Miss Cripps paused mid-typing, fingers suspended above the keys, her eyes fixed for a moment on the doorway, as though anticipating another arrival. The inspector left without comment, carrying with him the quiet question that now hung over the parish office. Which of these silent observers, through letters, ledgers, or personal attention, would next reveal the subtle truths that had been meticulously preserved and at whose discretion? The parish office retained the muted warmth of late afternoon, the sunlight now filtering through half-closed blinds, sketching narrow stripes across the polished desk and the stack of typewritten newsletters. Inspector Purbright arrived with his habitual quietness, noting immediately that Miss Cripps had shifted the envelope slightly as though to place it beyond casual observation, yet within her personal surveillance. The typist's composure remained impeccable, yet there was a subtle tightness to her shoulders that suggested anticipation rather than fatigue. "Good afternoon, Miss Cripps," Purbright said, inclining his head in acknowledgement. "I trust the morning passed without incident?" "Indeed, sir," she replied, voice measured as she adjusted a sheet of type. "Only routine visits and correspondence. No matter of consequence has arisen, at least none that I am at liberty to mention." The careful phrasing, the ellipsis of unspoken words, left an invisible space that Purbright noted with habitual attention. He moved slowly to the ledgers, running his eyes over the columns with deliberate scrutiny. Even minor deviations, the slight misalignment of an entry, a date omitted or lightly corrected, were recorded in his mind. Such trifles were often the fingerprint of hesitation, of discretion exercised in the shadow of expectation. "Mr. Penton, the treasurer, has requested a brief consultation," Miss Cripps said, almost as an aside. "He is concerned with the quarterly reconciliations and some discrepancies that were noted." Her eyes flickered briefly toward the envelope, as though weighing whether to mention its continued presence. Purbright nodded. "Very well. Ask him to join us here, if he pleases." The treasurer entered with the careful gait of a man accustomed to being observed, each movement precise, each gesture tempered by propriety. His eyes strayed to the envelope, lingering just long enough to suggest polite curiosity, without overt intrusion. "Inspector," he said, seating himself, "there are a few items in the accounts that do not quite reconcile. Subscriptions, small donations, and one or two miscellaneous entries are either delayed or undocumented." He spoke with the tone of someone reporting a minor inconvenience, yet the careful emphasis on order hinted at personal vigilance over reputations. Purbright's gaze rested on the ledgers. "I notice some entries are indeed offset, some corrected without notation. Have these discrepancies been investigated with the usual care?" "Indeed," Penton replied, glancing at Miss Cripps before returning to the inspector. "I have reviewed them with the utmost thoroughness. Yet, timing and order are sometimes disrupted, and while no malfeasance is suggested, one cannot help but note the irregularities." The typist tapped lightly on the typewriter keys, each sound deliberate, echoing faintly in the quiet office. Purbright allowed the silence to settle, letting the interplay of gaze, posture, and slight gesture communicate more than words could. Miss Cripps broke the quiet. "Some letters, sir, arrive for the treasurer directly from donors, though I am not always informed of the timing or content. It is recommended they be handled with discretion." Her careful inflection conveyed more than her words. There was an unspoken acknowledgement of the subtle hierarchies and obligations that governed access to information. Penton's glance, polite yet pointed, flicked toward the envelope. "I trust that all correspondence intended for myself has been duly recorded and acknowledged?" Miss Cripps inclined her head slightly. "Yes, sir. All communications are preserved according to instruction," Purbright interjected gently. "Yet timing remains irregular and the record shows minor inconsistencies. In such circumstances we rely upon discretion, awareness, and above all, restraint. An omission is rarely innocent, and a delay is rarely accidental." His words were mild, almost conversational, yet each carried the weight of scrutiny. Penton shifted in his chair, subtly signalling both acquiescence and unease. The atmosphere, still outwardly serene, held a quiet tension born of reputational vigilance and latent accountability. Outside, the muffled sound of a distant clock punctuated the passage of measured minutes, each toll reminding them that even small discrepancies, like whispers in a silent room, might be significant. "Inspector," Miss Cripps murmured, her fingers poised over the typewriter. "I believe Mr. Darrow has arrived for his scheduled discussion. He requested privacy as is customary." Purbright nodded. "Very well. We shall continue here, then." He observed the interaction with care, noting how Miss Cripps guided Penton's attention with subtle gestures while preserving her own impartiality. Even the seemingly insignificant movement of a ledger, the faint repositioning of an envelope, or the pause before a typed word carried social and procedural weight. The treasurer rose shortly thereafter, offering a precise nod before departing. Miss Cripps remained at her typewriter, now alone except for the inspector, yet her posture betrayed a heightened awareness. Purbright noted the way her eyes lingered on the envelope, not out of curiosity alone, but as if anticipating further observation, perhaps an inquiry or even an inadvertent misstep. He allowed his gaze to follow hers, noting how the envelope's presence seemed to impose a quiet rhythm on the room. Its contents, concealed yet palpably significant, had become a fulcrum around which propriety and scrutiny pivoted. There was no haste, no urgency, yet the simple act of waiting, observing, and recording small deviations had created an atmosphere dense with implication. Miss Cripps typed a few lines, paused, then lightly pressed the envelope with her fingertip, as though measuring its influence on the current moment. Her hesitation was minuscule, yet to Purbright it was rich with meaning, awareness tempered by duty, curiosity restrained by protocol. The tiniest gesture had revealed an internal negotiation, a silent appraisal of moral and social boundaries. As Purbright prepared to leave, he allowed one last sweep of the office, the subtle alignment of ledgers, the deliberate spacing of typed sheets, the quiet vigilance of a typist alone with both letters and conscience. The envelope remained, unbroken, a sentinel of discretion and an emblem of small but consequential human choices. The chapter closed with a faint, almost imperceptible shift. Miss Cripps paused mid-typing, her eyes drifting toward the window as though noticing a shadow outside, or perhaps anticipating an arrival, yet unannounced. In the careful architecture of routine, the envelope and the typist's measured response became a quiet question in themselves. What subtle revelation might emerge next, and whose discretion would determine its appearance? The morning began with the faint, habitual hush of the parish office, the air warm with the lingering aroma of ink and tea. Inspector Purbright entered without preamble, noting at once that Miss Cripps had slightly repositioned the envelope on her desk, nudging it nearer the edge, as if to remind herself of its quiet, unspoken importance. Her hands hovered over the typewriter, fingers poised but not yet in motion, a gesture that suggested careful consideration rather than urgency. "Good morning, Miss Cripps," Purbright said, his voice even, almost conversational, though measured to convey presence without disturbance. "Has the office experienced any unusual arrivals or correspondence overnight?" "Good morning, sir," she replied, inclining her head. "Only routine matters. One letter arrived addressed to me personally, though I was instructed to deliver it to the vicar without opening. It was discreet in nature." Her choice of words carried no flourish. The subtext, however, hinted at the silent pressures of discretion and hierarchy. Purbright allowed the silence to extend, punctuated only by the soft ticking of a wall clock and the faint shuffle of paper. He observed the slight narrowing of her eyes as she glanced at the envelope and the subtle stiffening in her posture, small betrayals of the internal calculus that governed propriety and secrecy. Before he could speak further, the door opened to admit Mr. Darrow, a man whose presence carried the faintest tremor of apprehension beneath formal civility. He greeted the inspector with a nod, then turned his attention to Miss Cripps, who acknowledged him with a measured lift of her eyebrows. "Inspector," Mr. Darrow began, his tone polite yet carefully modulated, "I have come regarding the recent correspondence with the Historical Society. Some letters have not yet been accounted for in the committee records." His phrasing suggested concern without accusation, yet the weight of implied oversight hovered. Purbright inclined his head. "Do you refer to timing, content, or a combination thereof?" "Primarily timing," Darrow replied. "It seems some letters have been delayed, others redirected, and a few remain unfiled. Procedural propriety, I fear, may have been inadvertently compromised." Miss Cripps adjusted a sheet of type, aligning it with meticulous precision, and then responded, "Only as directed, sir. All correspondence is preserved according to instructions. Any delays are procedural, not intentional." Her inflection remained neutral, yet there was a brief, almost imperceptible hesitation, a micro-gesture that suggested awareness of observation rather than of impropriety. Purbright allowed a silence to settle, watching Mr. Darrow's eyes as they flicked subtly toward the envelope. The man's polite restraint was counterbalanced by the faint tension in his hands, a sign that beneath formal decorum, questions were forming, questions that would not yet be voiced. "The record," Purbright said softly, moving toward the ledgers, "reveals small inconsistencies, an entry slightly offset here, a correction without annotation there. Individually trivial, yet collectively indicative of human intervention, deliberate or inadvertent." His words were descriptive rather than accusatory, a quiet demonstration of observation as a tool for comprehension. Darrow nodded, acknowledging the point without comment. Miss Cripps, meanwhile, typed a few deliberate lines, then paused, her gaze shifting toward the doorway as if measuring the room for invisible patterns of attention. The envelope remained untouched, yet its presence seemed to command vigilance, shaping both posture and expression in subtle ways. A quiet draft disturbed a loose page on the desk, revealing a folded sheet previously concealed beneath the newsletters. Purbright's eyes lingered on it briefly. The paper bore no seal, no signature, yet its displacement suggested recent handling. Miss Cripps's hand moved to replace it, but paused, hovering, a fleeting moment that betrayed a question unspoken. Had the page been mislaid, or was its position deliberate? Darrow cleared his throat. "I presume that all communications for the vicar and treasurer have been properly directed?" His voice, courteous and controlled, carried a trace of anxiety, as if the very phrasing might coax a confirmation or a slip of truth. "Yes, sir," Miss Cripps replied, her hand steady, yet the slightest tension in her fingers suggested the cognitive weight of discretion. "All correspondence follows the prescribed channels." Purbright's attention shifted from her hands to the ledger, noting the gentle misalignment of an entry that otherwise conformed perfectly to the established format. He made no remark. The observation was sufficient in itself, a subtle index of potential intervention. In a room governed by propriety, even a minor displacement could reveal the faintest pattern of human intention. Timing, sequence, and sequence alone, Purbright said, his tone neutral, often betray more than content. Observing the intervals between action and record is as instructive as reviewing the words themselves. He glanced at the envelope, at the displaced sheet, and then back to Miss Cripps, who had resumed typing with a deliberate rhythm that seemed both mechanical and watchful. Darrow departed shortly thereafter, nodding politely to both inspector and typist. His steps, though measured, carried the quiet weight of unresolved curiosity. Once the door closed, the office reverted to its usual cadence, the tapping of keys, the faint scent of ink, and the subtle orchestration of gestures that spoke more than conversation could. Purbright rose to leave, his attention drawn once more to the envelope and the displaced page. Each retained the same silent authority they had maintained since morning, quiet arbiters of procedure, discretion, and latent inquiry. Miss Cripps paused mid-typing, eyes momentarily fixed on the envelope as if anticipating yet another subtle intrusion into the patterns she had carefully preserved. The chapter closed with a faint shift. The displaced sheet, now replaced, carried a slight smudge of ink not previously present, a trivial anomaly, yet enough to provoke a quiet question in Purbright's mind. The office remained serene, but beneath the surface, the delicate lattice of discretion, oversight, and unspoken observation had shifted imperceptibly. Who had handled the page, and why had it been left momentarily visible? The answer, like so many in the parish, would emerge not through declaration, but through patient scrutiny of small gestures and silent intervals. The afternoon sun had retreated behind a thin bank of clouds, leaving the vicar's study in a softened, diffused light. Inspector Purbright entered quietly, noting the faint musk of old wood polish mingling with the lingering scent of fading ink. The room was a meticulous exercise in order, books aligned by author, ledgers stacked with careful regularity, and the vicar himself seated behind a desk that seemed more a tribunal than a workspace. "Good afternoon, sir," Purbright began, inclining his head toward the vicar, who looked up from a small pile of correspondence. His expression was mild, but behind it lingered a faint shadow of concern, as if every letter carried latent consequence. "Inspector," the vicar responded, his voice precise, courteous, yet slightly taut. "I trust your morning observations proceeded without undue disturbance?" "Routine," Purbright replied evenly. "Though minor irregularities have been noted, timing, sequence, and some unsent letters." His gaze swept the study, settling momentarily on a small stack of envelopes marked, but not yet addressed. The placement seemed deliberate, yet their presence suggested a temporary indecision, or perhaps concealment. The vicar's hands rested lightly upon his desk. "Letters awaiting dispatch," he murmured. "I prefer certain matters handled with care. Some correspondences, while routine, touch upon reputations best preserved from premature disclosure." His phrasing was formal, careful, but Purbright detected the faintest tension around the eyes, a subtle acknowledgement that discretion could carry both moral and social weight. "Yes, sir," Purbright said, "and there are indications that minor deviations from the expected schedule have occurred, perhaps unintentionally." He allowed the words to hover, neither accusatory nor apologetic. The vicar's fingers brushed a letter on the edge of the desk, adjusting it slightly, a silent confirmation of awareness without explanation. Miss Cripps entered with a quiet step, her tray of tea forgotten on the office table. She greeted the inspector with a nod and then arranged a cup for the vicar. The typist's movements were methodical, deliberate, almost ceremonial. Yet Purbright observed the subtle tension in her posture, the imperceptible awareness that her presence, while unobtrusive, was under constant scrutiny. "The committee has expressed some curiosity," Purbright continued, gesturing lightly toward the envelopes. "They notice irregularities in timing and sequence. Perhaps a review of pending correspondence would be prudent." His tone was neutral, almost conversational, yet the implication of oversight hovered unspoken. The vicar inclined his head slightly. "I am aware, Inspector, certain letters are indeed delayed, but for reasons of propriety, not neglect. Some are best reviewed before circulation, lest minor misunderstandings ripple into discontent." He paused, allowing a silence that was at once formal and instructive. Miss Cripps moved to retrieve a letter, holding it delicately. "Sir," she said softly, "this one arrived late yesterday. I have not yet been instructed to process it." Her careful phrasing suggested both obedience and subtle caution, as if revealing the letter carried potential consequence beyond its literal content. Purbright's attention shifted to the envelope, now held lightly in her hands. Its edges were uncreased, the seal intact, yet the manner in which it was presented, tentatively, with measured politeness, spoke more than its content ever could. He noted the faint shadow of hesitation in Miss Cripps's eyes, the slight stiffening in her shoulders, and the quiet deference to authority that was almost ritualized. "Leave it here for now," the vicar instructed, his tone calm, neutral, yet firm. "I shall determine the proper course for its contents." He gestured subtly to Purbright, a quiet acknowledgement that observation need not involve action, merely careful attention. Purbright allowed a pause, letting the study's quiet absorb all movements and gestures, even the faint scratch of pen on ledger, the tap of Miss Cripps's fingers on a teacup, seemed laden with meaning. He noted, and without comment, that small adjustments, marginal corrections, slightly misaligned entries, and the temporal spacing of letters formed a pattern of silent supervision, a lattice of responsibility, carefully maintained. "Inspector," the vicar continued after a moment, "we must all guard the appearance of propriety, even when the substance is beyond reproach. The eye of the community is less forgiving than the truth." His words, light and formal, carried a subtle warning. Observation itself could shape behavior, and discretion was a currency as weighty as action. Purbright inclined his head. "Indeed, sir. And it appears that some letters, though minor in content, act as markers for vigilance, small shifts indicating careful management of expectation, attention, and reputation." His voice remained steady, factual, a soft illumination of unspoken social pressures. Miss Cripps replaced the envelope, its position subtly altered from earlier, nudged slightly to the side, neither hidden nor prominently displayed. Purbright noted the gesture, trivial on its surface, yet revealing a microcosm of decision-making, an intentional displacement, a minor act of authority exercised within the bounds of propriety. The inspector rose to depart. He allowed one last glance around the study, the neat ledgers, the poised correspondence, and the vigilant typist. Each contained the quiet signature of habitual scrutiny, subtle negotiation, and unspoken hierarchy. As he stepped toward the door, he observed Miss Cripps pause mid-motion, her hand lingering above the typewriter keys. Eyes briefly fixed on a shadow near the window, a shadow that could have been merely the afternoon light or perhaps the faint trace of someone recently departed. The committee room, modest in size and austere in furnishing, was nonetheless invested with a peculiar intensity whenever business was at hand. The long oak table, polished to a dull reflection, bore a scatter of papers, ledgers, and the occasional inkblot, a record of diligence, human error, and the occasional hesitancy to commit opinion to paper. Inspector Purbright entered unobtrusively, nodding to the members already assembled, their attention divided between ledgers, whispered asides, and furtive glances toward one another. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," Purbright said, his voice calm and measured, without demand for attention. "I understand there are minor concerns regarding the recent correspondence and its presentation to the committee." Mr. Darrow, seated near the head of the table, inclined his head with polite gravity. "Inspector, there are small inconsistencies," he admitted. His phrasing was careful, as though any admission might trigger broader consequences. "Letters arrive out of sequence, and occasionally discussion is delayed pending review." He cast a brief glance toward Mrs. Radcliffe, whose hands rested atop her notes, with a tension that belied outward composure. Purbright allowed a pause, letting the quiet fill the room. The committee members were each aware that silence carried as much weight as speech. Even a subtle cough could betray curiosity, concern, or the faintest embarrassment. Indeed, Purbright said finally, in small communities, perception often outweighs the objective content of letters. Sequence, timing, and the apparent attention to protocol signal the integrity, or at least the vigilance, of those managing communications. He chose his words with care, neutral in tone yet incisive in implication. Mrs. Radcliffe adjusted her spectacles, the movement deliberate, almost ritualized. "We are all aware, Inspector," she said softly, "that delays, however minor, invite speculation, yet prudence sometimes requires measured discretion." The subtle stress on prudence suggested not mere observation, but a practiced negotiation of propriety and influence. Purbright's gaze swept the room, noting the faint tension in shoulders, the slight hesitation before glances met, and the almost imperceptible shifting of weight in chairs. "And is it clear," he asked, "who exercises discretion and who merely follows? There is a distinction, subtle but evident, between oversight and delegation." Mr. Fenwick, usually taciturn, cleared his throat. "Sometimes discretion is collective," he said, his voice low. "The responsibility for timing, for deciding which letters are addressed immediately, rests less on one individual than on the office as a whole." His words, careful and deliberate, carried the faint trace of unease, a recognition that responsibility, diffused, could nevertheless attract scrutiny. Purbright inclined his head slightly. Collective discretion, of course, carries with it a web of social expectation. Each decision, though minor in isolation, becomes a point of reference. Observed patterns, repeated omissions, and adjustments all reveal more than one might intend. A soft cough from the far side of the table drew his attention. Mr. Beale, fidgeting with the corner of a ledger, looked toward the envelope Purbright had seen earlier, now apparently circulating in the committee's records. The movement was slight, almost involuntary, yet it suggested awareness and curiosity. Purbright noted it without comment, the smallest gesture sufficient to signal an opening in the lattice of discretion. "Gentlemen," Purbright continued, "there is value in recognizing that even procedural oversight, if habitual, can shape expectations. Patterns of delay, sequence, or minor misalignment of entries are quietly observed by peers, subordinates, and those who will interpret them." He allowed the words to hang, their weight measured not in drama but in the subtle acknowledgement of surveillance that existed in every careful community. Mr. Darrow shifted, folding a note with meticulous attention. "Inspector, is it your suggestion that these minor irregularities carry significance beyond their practical effect?" He spoke formally, yet with a slight undercurrent of curiosity, and perhaps worry. Purbright's smile was faint, almost imperceptible. "Significance is rarely determined by action alone, Mr. Darrow. It is often discerned in hesitation, alignment, and the careful management of perception. A letter delayed, a ledger entry nudged slightly off-center, a glance held a second too long, all offer insight into discretion, intention, and the silent negotiation of propriety." Mrs. Radcliffe leaned back slightly, her hands folded, eyes momentarily dropping from the papers. "And yet," she observed, voice soft and deliberate, "some actions, while noted, remain unremarked upon, unexamined even, perhaps because the community prefers its appearances preserved." Her words suggested not defiance, but an acknowledgement of hierarchy and tolerance. Purbright inclined his head, permitting the thought to settle without further emphasis. The room, though outwardly quiet, thrummed with the tension of attentiveness. Each member's posture, the direction of a glance, the deliberate manner of note-taking, all were signals, subtle but revealing if one cared to notice. The inspector's attention fell upon the envelope, now resting atop a ledger at Mr. Beale's side. Its presence, ordinary yet conspicuously placed, suggested that some minor shift had occurred. He observed the small crease at the corner, barely perceptible, the product perhaps of handling, perhaps of intentional adjustment. In the quiet discipline of committee life, such a detail carried silent significance. "As we consider routine procedure," Purbright said softly, "one must bear in mind that vigilance often outpaces the immediacy of events. Each minor irregularity is an invitation to observe, to understand, and perhaps to anticipate." His gaze lingered on the members in turn, noting the slight stiffening of shoulders, the brief meeting of eyes, the small adjustments of ledger corners, all microcosms of observation and subtle negotiation. The meeting concluded with the usual formalities, and members rose, moving with careful grace, each performing minor rituals of acknowledgement and discretion. Purbright noted the subtle shift in Mr. Beale's posture as he tucked the envelope beneath a ledger, not fully hiding it, yet suggesting a deliberate reassignment of attention. As the inspector departed, the faint rustle of papers and soft footsteps receded, leaving the room with a lingering weight of vigilance, anticipation, and quiet moral calibration. The chapter closed on this almost imperceptible note. A ledger slightly askew, an envelope repositioned, and the silent question that now lingered unspoken. Who among these attentive observers would next reveal the quiet truths that even the most minor gestures had begun to disclose? The day had advanced into late afternoon, and the parish office carried the familiar hush of concentrated attention. The sunlight, now muted by a thin haze of cloud, cast a subdued pattern across the polished floorboards, emphasizing the quiet ritual of movement, Miss Cripps adjusting papers, Mrs. Aldridge placing cups with care, and Purbright himself moving with deliberate, unobtrusive steps. A knock at the door was answered by Miss Cripps, whose precise inclination of the head suggested a careful balance between welcome and protocol. The visitor, Mr. Jowett, entered with his habitual air of mild formality, carrying a small bundle of documents. He nodded to Purbright with restrained courtesy, the kind of gesture that acknowledged authority without presumption. "Inspector," Mr. Jowett began, his tone formal, yet tinged with mild concern, "I have brought the latest subscription records. There are discrepancies of timing, minor as they may seem, that the committee has found troubling." His eyes, sharp despite their polite veneer, flicked toward the stack of ledgers on the table, then briefly toward the typist. Purbright observed the subtle hesitation in Mr. Jowett's posture, the slight tightening of the jaw, and the momentary pause before the visitor laid the papers down. Each movement, though innocuous on its face, carried the weight of awareness, of consequence, of reputation, and of silent scrutiny. "Minor discrepancies often attract more attention than their substance warrants," Purbright said evenly, inclining his head toward the visitor. Yet in a community attuned to propriety, even small deviations suggest oversight, intention, or perhaps an unspoken adjustment of procedure. Miss Cripps moved to the desk, smoothing one of the records with meticulous care. The tip of her finger lingered over a marginal note, as though weighing the propriety of inspection against the potential implications of discovery. Her hesitation was imperceptible to anyone not attuned to the rhythm of micro-gestures, yet Purbright noted it, recording the moment quietly in his mind. Mr. Jowett cleared his throat. "It is difficult, Inspector," he said, "to determine whether such discrepancies arise from inadvertence or from deliberate recalibration. The temporal order, after all, carries significance beyond the immediate content of the letters or payments." Purbright allowed a measured pause, letting the quiet settle over the office. The teacups, the faint scratch of Miss Cripps's pen, the subtle alignment of ledgers, all were part of the lattice through which human intention, restraint, and the careful negotiation of responsibility could be discerned. "One observes, Mr. Neats, Jowett," Purbright said finally, "that responsibility is often shared yet unevenly perceived. Those who record, those who report, and those who interpret each hold a small piece of the total pattern. Discrepancy is rarely solitary. It is the product of layered attention or inattention." Mrs. Aldridge, moving silently to refill a cup, paused mid-step, her eyes briefly meeting Purbright's. The gesture was simple, almost accidental, yet carried a subtle question, awareness, complicity, or the faintest unease at being observed. "Indeed," Mr. Jowett replied, placing the bundle of records neatly beside the existing ledgers. Yet in the absence of overt negligence, one wonders whether the pattern itself, in its deviation, signals a subtle intention or merely human fallibility. His voice was formal, calm, yet the words suggested a trace of worry, an acknowledgement that reputation, once questioned, could not easily be restored. Purbright nodded slightly, his attention sweeping the room once more. The placement of papers, the slight tilt of a ledger, the brief hesitation before a cup was replaced. Each detail, while trivial in isolation, hinted at an underlying rhythm of vigilance. Observation, he reflected, was both a shield and a test. To notice was not to accuse, yet to ignore could permit the quiet propagation of irregularity. Miss Cripps lifted a single record, her fingers hovering above the page. "Sir," she said softly, "this entry appears out of sequence. I am unsure whether to proceed with correction or await instruction." Her phrasing was neutral, but the undercurrent was clear. The act of touching the record implied authority tempered by responsibility. Purbright inclined his head, allowing the silence to underscore the import of the question. "It may be prudent to await guidance," he said finally. "Yet note the occurrence. The observation itself is as instructive as any correction." The visitor, Mr. Jowett, murmured assent, though the slight tightening of his lips betrayed a subtle anxiety over the unresolved matter. The room, in its quiet, seemed to breathe with the weight of attentiveness, each small gesture magnified in the context of communal expectation, each hesitation pregnant with latent consequence. "Inspector," Miss Cripps added after a moment, "some letters arrived from outside the usual sequence yesterday. Their presentation may affect the interpretation of these accounts." She offered no further elaboration, yet her eyes lingered briefly on the envelope Purbright had noted in previous visits. Its sealed presence suggested a latent story, the quiet gravity of untold information. Purbright allowed a faint smile. "The order of arrival and the choice to observe, rather than immediately act, frequently reveals more than explicit instruction. Each adjustment, delay, or deferment carries subtle meaning." As the meeting concluded, Mr. Jowett gathered his papers with careful deliberation, nodding to both the inspector and the typist before departing. The office returned to its habitual quiet, punctuated only by the soft click of the typewriter and the gentle repositioning of ledgers. Purbright paused at the desk, observing Miss Cripps. Her hand lingered momentarily over the envelope, then withdrew, leaving it slightly askew, neither prominently displayed nor concealed. The faint shift was imperceptible to all but the most careful observer, yet to Purbright it suggested a conscious negotiation of authority, a minor but deliberate assertion of discretion. The following morning arrived with a peculiar stillness, as if the village itself had taken a breath in anticipation of the day's minor, yet consequential reckonings. Inspector Purbright walked through the familiar streets, noting the subtle symmetry of shutters, the careful sweep of doorsteps, and the unobtrusive surveillance of neighbours glimpsed through curtains. Each gesture, however mundane, was a reminder of the silent economy of attention in which the community thrived. Entering the parish office, he found Miss Cripps seated at her typewriter, poised yet hesitant. The envelope that had shifted position in the previous meetings now lay on the desk, its seal intact, but its presence somehow more charged. Purbright's eyes lingered briefly on it, noting that its edges were perfectly aligned with the ledger beneath, a careful gesture, deliberate yet understated, perhaps meant to signal nothing, or perhaps to invite observation. "Good morning, Miss Cripps," he said, inclining his head. "Has there been further correspondence of note?" She glanced up, her expression composed, but attentive. "Only routine matters, Inspector. Though some letters have arrived from unexpected sources, they were set aside pending your guidance." Her tone was formal, her eyes revealing a faint trace of curiosity restrained by habitual propriety. Purbright allowed the silence to stretch, permitting the significance of her words to settle. Even the smallest action, letters arriving, papers realigned, glances exchanged, carried latent meaning. He observed how her hand hovered above the typewriter keys, fingers poised yet unwilling to act without tacit approval. The hesitation was minor, almost imperceptible, yet in its careful restraint lay a message about discretion and the subtle power of placement. The vicar arrived shortly thereafter, his entrance quiet, measured, as though every step was designed to preserve decorum rather than merely traverse space. He acknowledged Purbright with a nod, and the inspector returned the gesture, recognizing the familiar ritual of mutual awareness. "Inspector," the vicar began, voice light yet precise. "The committee has been reviewing the records. Minor discrepancies, as you noted, have prompted questions. Prudence dictates that they be addressed with circumspection, lest reputations suffer unduly." Purbright inclined his head, noting the careful phrasing. "Discretion is frequently more illuminating than action, sir. Even the mere placement of a document can speak to attention, intention, and responsibility." The vicar smiled faintly, a gesture that suggested both agreement and the subtle acknowledgement of an unspoken game. "Indeed. And sometimes the appearance of vigilance is sufficient to maintain propriety, even when the underlying facts are unremarkable." Miss Cripps, moving with measured grace, lifted the envelope. "Shall I place this with the latest records, sir, or await instruction?" Purbright's gaze shifted. Noting her deliberate care, "Place it with the others," he said quietly. "The act of observation and its careful documentation will speak for itself." The typist complied, aligning the envelope with the ledger beneath. The gesture was minor, yet in its precise execution lay a quiet assertion of authority and awareness, an acknowledgement that responsibility, however delegated, demanded attention. For a moment, the three figures remained in silence, each attuned to the rhythm of observation. The slight tremor of a hand, the brief hesitation before a nod, the careful alignment of papers. Purbright reflected on how the community, in its collective discretion, had produced a lattice of expectation in which even the smallest gestures were laden with significance. "Inspector," the vicar continued after a pause, "it seems that the matter of timing and sequence has been contained without disruption. Yet I suspect your presence alone has reminded all involved of the weight carried by seemingly trivial actions." Purbright inclined his head, offering a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "Observation is seldom neutral, sir. It shapes conduct in subtle ways, guiding decisions without overt interference. And sometimes the quietest vigilance reveals more than direct inquiry ever could." Miss Cripps replaced her hands on the typewriter, straightening the remaining ledgers, her posture now relaxed but alert, as though the act of alignment itself had resolved a small tension. Purbright noted the faint easing of her shoulders and the softening of her gaze, a signal that authority, when exercised with subtlety, need not provoke resistance. The vicar moved toward the window, adjusting the curtains to permit the soft, diffused light to fill the office. The envelope on the desk remained in place, a silent witness to the careful choreography of attention and restraint. Purbright allowed himself a final inspection of the room, noting the delicate lattice of observation, hesitation, and minor gestures that had resolved for the moment into a balance of propriety and subtle order. Even the smallest creases, the tilt of a ledger, and the positioning of an envelope had contributed to a quiet revelation of responsibility, intention, and communal expectation. As he departed, the inspector observed Miss Cripps glance briefly toward the envelope, then returned to her typing. In that fleeting look there was both acknowledgement and a question left unspoken, a reminder that vigilance, though temporarily concluded, was perpetual. Outside, the streets appeared unchanged, yet Purbright sensed the undercurrent of attention that persisted in every measured glance and quiet step. The day, like the community it nurtured, proceeded under the quiet governance of subtle oversight, reputational awareness, and the moral calibration of those who moved cautiously within its lattice. The final, almost imperceptible shift The alignment of paper, the considered placement of an envelope, the soft, questioning glance, left the inspector with the understanding that the truth often resides not in dramatic revelations, but in the silent architecture of attention, discretion, and the unspoken contracts of communal propriety.